Good morning, everyone. Thanks for being in this session where we present and hope to discuss a new working group to the Coalition of Private Investments in Conservation, an initiative that is being led by IUCN and that has a membership of, I think, close to 50 organizations. So far, over the last 2 years, Civic has focused on work groups that develop investment blueprints for certain sectors, like forest and landscape restoration, forestry, water ecosystems, agriculture, and currently we are looking at expanding the list of working groups with a work group that is going to focus on landscape finance. And I would like to give the floor to James Myers, who will give us an update of the work of Civic existing work groups.
Thank you. I'm David Myers, and I'm with the Conservation Finance Alliance, and we're a member of Civic, and it's nice to be here and share with you a little bit of information. The organization includes quite a range of partners from the NGOs that I mentioned and that are here, but also a lot of private companies. And the part of the objective is to really make a space where private companies can join, explain what their needs are, what their financing needs are, because there's a lot of interest in financing nature, and institutional investors, for example, have very specific needs, and so Civic is trying to figure out what those needs are and figure out how to address those. The purpose of the coalition is to deliver a material increase in private return-seeking investment in conservation, thereby generating a substantial increase in natural capital. Currently, investments and donations in biodiversity, nature worldwide are about $50 billion, and it's estimated that we need somewhere around $400 billion a year to finance nature and to make sure that the ecosystems that nature provides are giving us the services we need. But the problem is governments are very limited, and so there's strong hope that the private sector could come in and fill part of this financing gap. So how are they doing it? By removing the impediments to large-scale investment in conservation, specifically the lack of cash flow awareness in project developers, and lack of projects at scale and inadequate risk-return profile. So you have a lot of people out there doing great things for nature. They want investment, but they just don't understand what they need to do to get that investment in. And at the same time, you have institutional investors that want to invest in nature, but they don't understand so much the space, and the idea is to make sure that those two connect. So Civic seeks to standardize, replicate, and aggregate opportunities for investment. And to do that, we're creating these investment blueprints, which are sort of like models of what a good investment could be, connecting pipeline providers with investors, and to convene projects with investors so that that the investors can say, hey, this is what we're looking for, and then to share this information broadly through all the members and through partners. So currently, so far there have been 5 working groups, and we're adding this 6th one. Is that right? No, we're counting right? Yes. So one is the Forest Landscape Conservation and Restoration, led by the European Investment Bank. There's a working group on coastal resilience, led by TNC and Environmental Defense Fund. Sustainable Fisheries by Conservation International and Credit Suisse. Sustainable Agricultural Intensification by Rainforest Alliance and the Global Environment Facility. Green Infrastructure for Watershed Management. And now our proposed working group here, Landscape Finance, led by IUCN Netherlands and EcoAgriculture Partners. And this landscape finance part will actually help contribute to all of them and make sure that they integrate landscape issues. And Sarah's going to tell us more about that. So some of the components of the Civic project right now: there's a secretariat that organizes a steering committee, and there's meetings pretty much every 2 years. Every 2 years. Every 2 years, 2 times a year, every 6 months. There's blueprint development going on in each of the working groups. They're developing very specific blueprints on specific projects that are either operational or about to be operational, or ideas that that could be investable, and there'll be endorsement of those and then public dissemination. There's actually an online guide to producing blueprints that can be found on the website. If you type in Civic conservation in Google, you'll find it. And then connecting pipeline providers with the deal structuring support. There's a facility that's being developed to provide support to people, to project developers, and we'll make some initial investments, providing some technical assistance, as well as potential investments in about 5 projects over the next few years. And then convening, as I mentioned, members meet twice a year. They work on these blueprints. They look at these deal opportunities, and then finally information sharing. As I mentioned before, publication of these blueprints once they're completed, and sharing the different business models. The idea is to scale, provide models that are scalable, replicable, and then share that information broadly. So that's my quick introduction to Civic, and do I pass on to you? Okay. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. I would like now to give the floor to Sarah Scher from EcoAgriculture Partners, who is leading the work on setting up a landscape working group under Civic.
Facilitating. Thank you very much. That was a great, very good overview presentation. When CPIC was first, do I need to do this myself? Let's see. Where's my PowerPoint? They should have it. Yeah, it's in here. No, the PowerPoint is in here. Is let me just check with could you run and check with Lou, and I'll get started without it. But it's nice to have one when they have. Okay, so when CPIC was started, as I understand, and EcoAgriculture is a relatively new member of CPIC, and we actually got roped into this by WWF Landscape Finance Lab, who should have been on that list of the co-leaders of this working group. But the focus was very much on the things that financial institutions were comfortable doing, which was a specific deal. We would like to be able to invest in large scale in coffee agroforestry systems. What does that kind of an investment look like? You know, how should it be designed? What's the cash flow that you could expect? What are the series of investments that when is the returns going to come? That kind of thing. And there was not any discussion initially, although the word does appear once or twice in the original CPIC document, about looking at these investment strategies from a broader landscape perspective. However, there's a number of really strong reasons why CPIC does need to be thinking about these landscape investments. The first one is, of course, that biodiversity, which is the co-benefit that's expected from these profitable investments, is so spatially sensitive and can actually be achieved by doing something good in one place. It helps, but it doesn't necessarily achieve it. Another thing is that there are a lot of these corporate commitments to deforestation. Oh, lovely. Thank you so much. That's fine. I'm still in my intro. Where there is a corporate commitments to some of these things, they're looking for opportunities, and they are already. There's another session this afternoon that Olam is putting together about the amazing acceleration of interest by agribusiness in doing landscape types of projects with partnerships and things like that. And then the third thing, there's actually a lot of risks to investments caused by the landscape context and potential opportunities, and if they're not aware of them, they could in fact have investments that look good on paper but don't actually deliver on their objectives. So this draft terms of reference, Frank Hawkins from IUCN, we had a series of a small informal conversations with WWF, IUCN Netherlands, and some other partners about the need for this. Frank Hawkins, who's managing this project for IUCN, because we're sitting there in DC too, we had a lot of conversations with him. He said, well, why don't you go ahead and put together what the terms of reference are, and let's see whether the CPIC partners really want to move forward on doing landscape finance. So the objective of this session right now is to briefly give you an overview of what this working group with a number of other partners from Cornell and from Conservation Finance Alliance, the group grows bigger every week because there's a lot of interest in this topic. We want to show you what we've come up with and get feedback from you if this is what you think that this group should try to do. Okay, so there's basically 6 elements to the terms of reference. And I'll go into them individually, but it's actually having a dialogue among CPIC collaborators, including the financial sector partners, to really get awareness and make sure we're all on the same page around landscapes. Developing it actually shouldn't say screen. I think this is, anyway, it should say criteria for CPIC investment enterprises, reviewing strategies and models, multi-project landscape investment blueprints for some of these models that we identify, and then providing advisory input for some of the specific other working groups. And we've already had this request from the agriculture and forestry working groups to get some technical assistance. So I'm going to very briefly take you through what we're anticipating producing from this. So the first one is to get, there's a part of the finance world that is already worrying and thinking about landscape, and there's a much larger part that doesn't even know what that is. And so we felt it would be valuable to have a dialogue process, and the outputs from this is to come up with the working group the 5-page rationale for why the landscape context is important for investment, and mapping CPIC interest and activities in this so that it helps sort of guide the next steps of CPIC. The second piece of it, it actually should say criteria. I think this isn't the most updated of my PowerPoints, but it's very close. But where we want to actually look at what has been learned from various sources around what does affect an individual investment from a landscape point of view, and come up with a very user-friendly, easy checklist for investment actors to use when they're looking into their enterprise-specific investment, and also that incorporate the third item, which we're EcoAgriculture is particularly important and interested in, because we've got a 1,000 landscape. We have a 1,000 landscapes initiative that started this year on really trying to systematically look at the different models that are out there, not for investing in one landscape-friendly investment, but for getting clusters of investments that have synergies among them so that you actually achieve transformation in your landscape objectives at scale. If you're trying to create a biological corridor in a place, you need a series of investments that all are contributing to that biological corridor. What are the models? And there used to be 5 years ago not a lot of models for doing that, but there's a lot of innovation that's going on right now around that. So we're going to try to systematically review those, take stock of them, discuss them, and then figure out for a few of those where they've either already been implemented or are in the process of being implemented, what do they really look like, and build blueprints for them that show how are they structured, how is the financing managed, how is the coordination managed, et cetera. And then we have a landscape sourcing report that WWF Landscape's Finance Lab is going to be leading, which is taking a bit of a different perspective. It's more industry-wide. It's about a sourcing strategy for a company. But companies are very important financial actors and investors themselves. And so looking at what comes out of that sourcing study and then in putting that into and enriching the checklist that individual enterprise blueprints would potentially use. And finally, there was actually a strong desire from the people involved in enterprise-specific blueprints to get advice from the group, the landscape working group that does have some experience in putting together synergistic landscape investment portfolios at a landscape scale. So we're not quite sure how we're going to mobilize that, but there's certainly already been reaching out to try to get that help. And I think that is the last slide. So I'm going to just leave on here the list for our discussions. And before we open it up to you, there's a few people here who have been involved in this process that we've asked them to give a couple minutes. So let me.
Yeah, so Paul Chatterton, first, I would like to ask you to give some comments on this development.
Thanks, Jan, Willem, and Sarah, and great, Sarah, that you and Jan are leading this forward. I had the privilege to join one of the Civic meetings last year, I think it was, in the top of the Rockefeller Center with a whole lot of environmentalists and bankers. And the bankers said, we're not interested in your game. It's far too small. When it crosses the boundary of $100 million, we'll get a little bit interested. When it gets to $1 billion, then we get really, really interested. And if you look at where climate finance has gone over the last few years, it's all into energy and infrastructure projects. So it's easy to do a wind farm program, couple of $100 million. It's easy to do a train transition or electric bus transition in a city, 100 million, $1 billion. It's not easy to do agricultural forestry projects or fishery projects. And this is the struggle of CPIC, that the blueprints that they're doing are for each of those, forestry, agriculture and fisheries, but the projects won't get to scale. So the landscape work is incredibly important. It's where you can aggregate different activities, the same sort of activities across a lot of geographies, or different activities within a geography and get it up to the $100 million scale, so it actually registers on the screen of your Deutsche Bank banker or your Citibank banker. That's the challenge we have. I think it's really, really exciting what we're doing. Whether we can pull it off or not, I don't know. And I'll give some comments in a second. Just one other thought. I was reading the history of the railways in 1840, and this is bear with me, this is connected. Before 1840s, there had been railways for hundreds of years. There were many pieces, and George Stephenson just simply put an engine on a railway. There were horse-drawn railways and so forth. What he really did, though, the real invention that he created, and which triggered 30,000 kilometres of railways being built in 10 years, the real invention was a railway company. So he put together the idea, the engineering, an engine on wheels, on a rail, with the politics, who approves doing this, with the financiers. Now that's where we are right now with landscape finance. It's so exciting. This is so important what we're doing here. And just a couple of challenges back to those of you who are putting this together and to all of us. One, let's design it, let's have it driven by the financiers, because they speak, it has to work for their Deutsche Bank screens and their ticker tapes or whatever they use these days. It has to work for them. And so we can propose how the environmental side of it works, the social side, but we have to be driven by them on the financial side and the financial structurings. We have to get more financiers on the team to put this together. And Sarah, I think that's right. The corporates are the ones, the big corporates, the big companies are the ones that deliver the money into the landscapes and produce it out of the landscape. So how can we use their power to make the financiers interested in all of this? We're working with some of the biggest companies in the lab. Sarah and her team are as well, IUCN. So this landscape sourcing report is going to be looking at how you can use that power of purchasing out of a landscape to get the financiers interested to start talking about a landscape program. And I guess the big challenge in that is also how not to forget the little people and the little businesses and your $1 a day businesses in the landscape, which are just as important as your $1 billion a year businesses in the landscape. So just a challenge and back. But I think this is very exciting stuff. Let's do what George Stevenson did and create landscape companies or landscape institutions or landscape products that appear on the dashboards and the screens of the bankers.
Thanks, Paul. I myself was also asked to give some comments to this process, and Paul, as we say in the Netherlands, you helped cut the lawn in front of me a little bit because I had similar points to make, so I'll make it short. But when this discussion first started, the people at Civic said, "Whoa, landscape, let's not make it too complicated because it's already complicated enough to get to this level of investment blueprints for sectors." So I won't yet dwell on the benefit that I think the landscape component will have on the sectors, but I certainly also see for the landscape work, we can learn already a lot from what has been done at the sectoral level. And when you look at the landscape, the problem is that often we use development finance to help build the capacity of local actors, development business cases, all the rest of it. But time and time again, we see that the projects that we develop are not bankable, and they're not at the scale of the financiers, as you mentioned. And the problem is that when we develop these projects with donor money, we don't actually look in detail what is the differentiation of the local actors, the smallholders. Because the smallholders are key, because we have to develop cash flows in the landscape, and it's smallholders that are able to have a return on investment through the land of the use of the land, whether it's for agriculture or for partly ecosystem services. So, and this group has to be differentiated because the investors have to deal with different actors with different risk types in the landscape. So we have to first, as a first step when we work in the landscape, we have to sit down with the local banks who eventually will be able to invest, and we have to differentiate the smallholders. And when loans are structured, the monitoring of the performance of the farmers, both in financial terms as in terms of impact, has to be assured. The monitoring has to be assured over the entire period, so that the investor also understands, where they are standing with the loan. So we really have to change the way that we are working in the landscape. So sit down and look right at the start of programs. Who are the local banks? Who are the international impact investors that can help with the early monitoring systems and the models in which local banks can invest, and also how development finance can be best used to make this workable from the start. So that is something that we at IUCN, of course, also try to do at IUCN NL. We develop these products and tools that help bridge the international finance with the local work on the ground. Having said that, we would be really interested to hear your comments, your questions, your critics, and so I will open up the floor.
We have a second microphone here, so pass it around.
Yeah, and please sign up the sheet with your contact details for us and for sharing, please. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for your presentation. My question is referring to Stephenson, how such an Stephenson-like organization for lands would look like?
Man, that's like asking someone what a railway company looks like in the 1830s. No one knows, but I think we'll know very quickly. And that's what this experimentation will show us. And I think it's we're not talking about producing just one blueprint. We're talking about producing a couple, testing them out, and maybe we'll have to go through 5, 10 iterations until we're all agreed on something that works, or more importantly, the market is agreed on something that works, because their investment will tell us what really does work. It takes us all working together and testing these things out. Are there landscape institutions in the way that there are railway companies? Well, I'll give that one to Sarah. She's
When you all ask questions, would you tell us also your name? Where are you from?
My name is Ben ten Brink. I'm from the Netherlands
Yes,
Environmental Assessment Agency. Sorry.
I knew that, but I didn't think everybody else did. I think this is this point that that Paul was saying. Actually, there are starting to be a number of institutions that are out there. First of all, there's hundreds and hundreds that we've documented of formal landscape partnerships that have multiple stakeholders aiming at landscape-wide transformation with different entry points, whether it's water or biodiversity or land degradation or green economy or many different entry points, moving partners to work together and develop action plans around that landscape that involve companies doing this activities and local governments doing that, and processing plants cleaning up their water filtration. I'm thinking of Honduras here. And so actually many things need to happen at the same time. And so you actually have a lot of this landscape-wide action planning going on. The problem is there's this huge disconnect between the plans, and they get 5% of the money that you need to implement the plans. So I would say I don't think most of these platforms are actually structured to manage funds themselves, but they are structured to help facilitate the conversation with the banks that Jan Willem is saying. So we have some models where funds are made specific to that landscape, and lots of investors can put that in, and the stakeholders decide how the money is going to be done. You have landscape developers coming up, Common Land, that goes around and actually plays the role of setting up projects and sets of them. We thought there was only 2 or 3 models, but as Paul says, now that we're really looking at what people are doing, you're seeing a lot of models, and we haven't really taken stock of those.
Thanks. Other comments?
Hi, my name is Christina. I'm from the UK, and I work for a tea and coffee business, and I look after sustainable sourcing. So I was really interested to hear about this report of yours about landscape sourcing. Is this something that's already out there, or are you still working on it? And if so, just the second half, how do you see the role of private sector, but also maybe at a smaller scale, so not necessarily at the large international corporations level, but what is the role and the possibility and opportunity for relatively smaller but still really committed businesses who want to join in on this conversation and have some funding available for landscape restoration as well?
Yeah, so whatever the landscape institution is, the railway company, it has to work for the small companies as well as the big, for the communities and so forth. And what that looks like, we don't know. I mean, you take the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority in Australia, which benefits big and small businesses enormously, because it's created this idea that's pulling in tourists, that's managing the reefs, managing fisheries, so everyone benefits. How can we do something like that? And if you're interested in this report, we're bringing together the first group of people to work out how to do it tomorrow morning at breakfast in the next door.
I also have a response to your comment. I see that it is incredibly important to work with SMEs, both SMEs in the landscape or SMEs outside the landscape that have a presence in the country. For example, we, through our IUCN NL projects, we brought together a timber management and finance company with our NGOs, and the collaboration was first a little bit awkward because the NGO thought like, oh, it's a timber company, you know, it's not, maybe not the greenest. But within a few months, they started to work on models for the restoration of disused gold mining sites. And within a year, they were working in 2 landscapes on restoration, bringing back trees in the landscape. And through the SME and another SME that the NGO was already working on in the Shia space, quite quickly the link was made to the global, for example, Shia producer company network with 300 companies, and now also in the cocoa. So you see that within a few years, the model that is developed together with a small, medium-sized company and an NGO, which is a dark green solution to restore degraded land, is in 3 landscapes linked to different value chains, in the cocoa, in the Shia, and in the timber space, in different landscapes. And they're now working towards models, and there's already been taken up the model by the World Bank. There's a large green climate fund proposal in the Shia landscape. There's still a lot of hurdles, but it's quite interesting exactly the link of small and medium companies in the landscape.
Just a real quick comment. One of the specific things about CPIC is its aim to shift, not just get impact investors who only spend $100 million. I know for a lot of us that seems like a lot of money. It's not a lot of money in the financial system. And right now, most of the money going into sustainable investments in landscape from the private sector are from things like these $50 to $100 million in funds of impact investors. And the point of CPIC is, as I think Paul, well, both of you were saying, is to unlock the billions, the $100 billion investments, and they are not going to be able to get that money directly to small and medium enterprises. And I think that's the reason why CPIC is a coalition of both the NGOs and the financial institutions working together, because governments and NGOs need to figure out how do you do the aggregation and how do you do the finance distribution so that a big chunk of money that comes into the landscape flows into the SMEs as well. The banks won't do that directly, or the impact.
David Hodgson. Talking to the corporate role, though, I mean, the main thing there is offtake agreements, right? You need long-term offtake agreements, basically, so that the cash flows can be justified for the financiers, so that the investment can flow.
That's a comment, not a question, right? Yeah. Yeah.
Hello, Simone Quattrini from Aedis. It is fascinating, Paul, this idea of landscape companies to harness the potential that is out there that is not fully exploited or put into commercial use, so to speak. And I just wanted to share a potential model that is already out there that could be looked as a source of inspiration for coming up with new companies of that kind of typology, which are not there yet. But for example, in the tourism sector, you have all these agencies that promote tourism in a landscape or in a region, and they are, in some cases, very successful in attracting investment, but also in attracting business revenue, business generation that then is benefiting the whole community that lives in that landscape, be it in the hotel sector, but also in the agriculture and food producing sector. There are several examples like that that have been extremely successful in Italy, where I come from, agri-tourism models. Another interesting parallel is also with in the developing world with investment promotion agencies that have the public mandate to actually attract foreign investments into specific areas for specific purposes. And it could be interesting to plug into their approach this additional dimension, which is how to make the best use of landscapes in addition to producing outputs or export generated growth, but also generating all kinds of ecosystem services benefits that can then be distributed to the local communities and also, you know, to the national economy. So I think it's extremely interesting that there is certainly a lot that can be reflected upon, looking also at the example of special economic zones that these planning agencies are setting up. So again, here the challenge is mainly to build on the ecosystem services models to create something that generates value that can then be distributed to the various shareholders, which in that case would be landowners, I guess, land users and other communities that live there. Very fascinating.
In the agencies that you mentioned, I think there's also a clear government role in it, isn't it? Yeah.
It could be a way to actually promote public-private partnerships. This is certainly, you know, we're talking about ecosystem services that produce benefits to the public, but also benefits to the private sector. So it's a perfect rationale for having more PPPs.
Yeah, it's an important point because also, for example, the landscape investment and finance tool that we've developed with the EcoAgriculture Partners explicitly also looks at international as well as local finance, existing as well as new to be attracted finance, and what's the other one? Yeah, and private and public. Yeah.
So just, I'm just making this up as I go along, but following your idea, I looked it up. The world economy is $78 trillion a year at the moment. And if there's 1,000 landscape, that means that each landscape on average is worth about produces $50 billion a year. Now, in some sectors and in some landscapes, that's going to drop dramatically because of climate change. We're talking with one of the world's largest cocoa producers. They're looking at a 40% reduction in cocoa production in the next 10 years. So at the time when India and China want a lot more chocolate. So, you know, just in terms of chocolate production, there's a disaster going on, and that can only be addressed at landscape scale. So if we think about every other sector on the planet, that $50 billion is going to, per landscape, is going to start going down. Where can we make sure it doesn't go down, rebuild the system to make it climate proof, and make sure the economy continues to grow? And from that point of view, it becomes very economical to work right now at landscape scale.
We haven't heard everyone yet. Any more questions, thoughts?
Is anything going on around this?
Sorry, Sarah. I'm in listening mode now. I'm very fascinated by this idea, and I agree. In getting, in particular, private finance mobilized, I think your comments were very helpful. I should say I'm coming from the OECD, and of course we have a keen interest in ways of managing biodiversity, territorial approaches to rural development, etc. But I think I was coming here because I think this is where we should make the next steps, but I don't have to contribute too much at this moment. But I only sense, and I think from the debates also in OECD, that's the way to go, and to mobilize and package the things so, as you said, that they get on the dashboards of the bankers, not just Deutsche Bank, but others.
Yeah. I think one important issue is, of course, also the demand for the landscape programs and the landscape approaches that we see are needed. Of course, we saw that with the carbon markets, it triggered a great pipeline development of all manner of projects also in the land use space that use the potential carbon market to come up with innovative projects, some of which are still being financed by funds like Altera Climate Fund, where the carbon is still, part of the overall solution. But at the moment, for example, in the Netherlands, when the ambitions for decarbonizing the economy are now taking traction, where there's a lot of focus on green transition, the question is, of course, how can the Dutch government, working together with the private sector, see how the demand for decarbonization of our impacts outside our boundaries in the land use sector, how can that be encouraged? With what kind of system? And in that light, one of the sessions, I think tomorrow, where Verra landscape standard is being presented, is also it's an interesting one, because the Verra landscape standard tries to both help local governments achieve their NDCs, contribute to reduce deforestation, while also translating the reduced deforestation impact into a way that satisfies the needs of companies to de-risk their value chains, to improve or the way people look at them, their how do you call it? No, their reputation, their reputational risk. So yeah, there's interesting things going on, but the demand for those projects, of course, is an important part.
I just had a real quick comment following up on yours. I think that this landscape-wide investment strategy is a potential set of solutions for the problem of extreme siloing by sector of finance, so that even carbon finance, biodiversity finance, water finance, are so siloed right now, and these could be models that would allow them to, basically meet all of those goals with a specific set of investments.
Thank you. I was just so still tea and coffee business, but I'm wondering, related to your last comment about a reputation of de-risking for a private sector, how do you see the connection between landscape and sort of conservation-related landscape programs and then development-related landscape? Do you also think, or does CPIC work with development as well, now looking at the socio-economic impact as well, not only the conservation impacts? Is there some sort of link? And the second part of the question, there's so many of these different landscape approaches popping up. How do you see the potential for competition between some of them already, I can see, for the recognition that we've got the best landscape approach? And then how do you envisage our whole industry to overcome that sort of urge for competition?
Yeah, I think in Civic, sustainability by definition includes both social and environmental sustainability. Green and inclusive green growth is of course looking at both parts of the puzzle. Tell me if I'm wrong. and what you just said, yeah, the competition, yeah. But for example, with the landscape standards, the landscape models, there is some competition, and I think to some extent that is healthy, because may the best win. And I think you already see a lot of collaboration, for example, with Rainforest Alliance and Verra, and different certification schemes that are already merging. So yeah, I think eventually it will probably evolve towards a few landscape standards, and there's enough diversity of landscapes that probably allows for a certain diversity of standards and approaches.
I want some few comments. When one can see the perspective of the landscape, one can see like a lot of mosaic based on the multi-stakeholders working in the landscape. So, and there is several countries, especially we to look for the planet. That means where is the more concentration of the poverty, where the most concentration of the biodiversity, where the most concentration that, raw materials we provide to industry is on development countries. That means how to make a noise in terms to the new perspective to development, sustainable development issues. So landscape approach is excellent idea, but still is like a puzzle, So that means my experience is we need to be more smart to drive in solutions for specific issues, and one of them is environmental and social issues. Migration, for example. That means if we want to make a noise trying to invest or to get funds, we need to think about in the long term what is the risk analysis based on specific where the raw materials come from. You know, that means there is for me two strategies. One is to make like a continental approach, where is the more interesting proposal for the landscape investments. And when we are going down to the landscape, what are the most economic drivers? Of course, economic driver is very important for the landscape, no? But at the same time, to direct sessions with you said, the global market is demanding traceability and sustainable materials or raw materials. So that means, still for me, we can see a clear strategy for you to get the funds or to get investments. Still, it's my opinion, of course.
But do you mean an overarching strategy to locate those landscapes that have the highest priority? Or do you mean within the landscape, where, of course, a landscape approach means that you have a multi-stakeholder, multi-sector dialogue, collaboration that identifies the most crucial and urgent areas where solutions have to be found? But are you talking about the more overarching choice of which landscape should have priority, or the second?
Do you know, because it's very complex when we're talking a landscape, based on countries, based on specific landscape per country, that means the strategy can be to present a strategy to big investors, you know, because at the same time that they would like to be has integration in terms to divided investments, you know. So that means that it could be to have a platform. Okay, guys, this is the platform for, how to say, Mesoamerican, this is from African, South Africa, you know what I mean? To be and how to connect this strategy with the local governments, because, you know, they are the most responsible to manage natural resources and to manage the economy. That means.
Yeah, I think it's a very important point. And also, landscape approach doesn't mean to say, that you only focus on the landscape level, because the value chains, of course, the number of actors that earn from the landscape and earn more and more as you move further away from the landscape, all of these actors, of course, also has to be involved in the different value chains. And on top of that, related to the comment about business platforms, of course, the landscape is also well surfaced by national platforms where investors and ministries work together and look at where should our priority be in the coming 10 years or 5 years when it comes to international investors, plus a certain regional collaboration between countries in a certain region. All of that, I think, should be connected also to landscape programs or landscape approaches.
And I think that's the next stage. The CPIC is really about getting the finance folks around. The other side is getting the landscapes organized to demand the investments that they need. I was just looking at my clock and realizing we only have about 5 minutes. So I wondered if we could just take one more round of comments from you all about these 6 elements. Hopefully CPIC's last objective is communication and to make this information available to others who might find it useful. Can you give us some sort of brief suggestions on how this could be most useful to the work that you're doing? Anything you don't see in it? Any way you would like the results to be produced? Anything at all, but we'll take them very seriously, I promise.
Yeah, Ruud Grim from the Netherlands Space Office. I was very intrigued just by the question: what's in for the financial institutions when they invest in landscapes projects? So what will it bring them to them? So if you communicate that better, I think you have also a better communication with them.
Thanks. Any other comments, questions, things we should take on board?
I just wanted to comment to that because I think there's this bigger challenge of not saying, what are you going to get from this cocoa agroforestry system? It is really about shifting flows of finance from unsustainable activities, which is where 99% of the funding is going now, to shifting all of it to more sustainable. And the advantage of landscape and territorial approaches and really seeing of what is the investment challenge in particular places is saying, no, it's not that you're going to stop doing your really profitable things. It's you're going to do your really profitable things that really have biodiversity benefits as well. So I think we need to think about it that way rather than as saying, well, it's this whole nother set of things that people are going to do. At least that's, I think, the original.
I guess one last question, which would be, are agribusinesses involved in this process too? Because, again, for the same reason of they need to engage in a different way than they historically. Contracts probably have to change, right?
I think certainly the members of CPIC work extensively with agro businesses. I'm actually not sure if any some large companies are also a member, right? Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, there are several large consumer-based companies that are looking into sustainable supply chains that are interested in this because obviously they have a risk to their supply chains and they can't necessarily finance all the changes that are required to achieve that sustainability. So they're looking to the financial institutions to partner to invest in sustainable supply chains. So.
Just a last comment. I was really pleased to hear some of your responses to my earlier question about, yes, this is also looking at the socioeconomic benefits, but from what maybe the presentation itself entailed, it wasn't necessarily that clear to start off with. So if, especially from the private sector, it's always really important to look at both. So biodiversity, yes, but also the sustainability of livelihoods and the sustainability of sourcing of raw materials. But that's only possible if both the quality of life of people as well as the quality of the environment are kind of ensured. And if making this more explicit, if you're already thinking about it, might be useful. Thank you.
Thanks. Well, last but not least, Sarah, would you like to comment on what you've learned, how you're going to take this along in this process that we are jointly involved with?
I didn't hear any comments that didn't seem worthy of incorporating into the revised terms of reference, or at least in terms of how we're going to go about them. So thank you so very much. It was really helpful also in clarifying some of the communications around the work. We kept I don't know where that sheet of paper is, but we did that so that we can actually put you into the, do you have that, Lou? Did you get it? So that we can include you in the sort of broader group of people interested and who could comment on CPIC materials as they come in. But I also would really want to encourage you, if other people want to get involved in this, we're all really looking for partners. Paul's very, we really like, and Jan Willem, we need partners in specific pieces of this, and also models that you all are working with, if you can share with us. It was really helpful, Simone, to get those suggestions. With this idea of looking at the analogs in other sectors is something we've had on our minds for a long time at EcoAg, and I think it makes a lot of sense, and I know that Paul's been doing that. So that's all I have to say, Jan Willem. Thank you all so very much, and we will keep you posted.
Thanks a lot indeed. And I guess see you next year.
I'd be remiss if I didn't tell you that there is not dedicated funding for this program of work. So people right now are contributing from their own. If anyone has suggested good sources of funding that can go to this coalition to produce these, some or all of these, that would be very, very valuable.
Absolutely. Thanks a lot. And yeah, we're here also the rest of the weekend, of course.